participant. Goffman is a good example. Now, I'm going to talk about this as being a grounded approach, something that matters. It's not, I call it grounded approach rather than grounded theory. Grounded theory is confusing to people because the idea that it's a theory, what you do in a grounded approach is gather your data and then you apply a theory later. So it gets to be a little confusing to call it grounded theory when you don't start with a theory. So I call it a grounded approach. The other thing that I think I want to just remind you of before we start, ethnography is a concept. It's the way of thinking about doing research. You're trying to understand what it's like for someone to stand in their shoes. It is not participant observation is just one method in ethnography. It's not the only method in ethnography. It's one. Interviewing is an ethnographic method. You're trying to find out how people feel about their life, what their life looks like, but how they explain it, not just what you see. So in the textbook, they put the two together, participant observation and ethnography. In your mind, I want you to separate them. They should be separate chapters. Participant observation is the thing you do. Ethnography is the way of considering the material, what you would do with it. It's from that person's perspective. So bear that in the back of your mind. So Goffman used participant observation. When he's in the Shetland Islands, it's kind of like the Milgram experiment. He's there, he's observing. He knows except they know he's a researcher, so they're aware of that he's observing them. Hawthorne effect. Remember last week I talked about Hawthorne? The Hawthorne effect is it's how much do you impact the environment. So if he's there as an observer, they realize he's a foreigner, he's going to impact the environment just by virtue of being there. Like you did in your coffee shop. You went in as a customer, you've got a social role. They identify you in that role. So they've got to be aware that you're there, and you may well impact their activities. Now, they might after time get used to you being there, but every so often when they look at you, they say, oh, wait a minute, customer. They got to be careful what they say, the way they behave. So he would be aware. That would go on with the Shetland Islands research. The psych facility research he comes back and does is different. So the psych facility research goes to two things. It goes to the beginning, what I'd said in week one. Pick a topic that's interesting to you. His wife has mental health issues. She's going to be institutionalized likely. So he decided to do research to find out what life would look like for her if she goes into an institution. That's about as close as you get to being personal, your research. Make it meaningful to you, then it's easier to do, and you have to be cautious of your biases, but you know that it's going to be meaningful research to you. So when he went in, he goes in and he took a low status role. What that does is give him free access to make observation. If he went in as a doctor, a nurse, an orderly, those people all have keys. They have authority. Like the scientist in the Milgram experiment, they have some decision making or comments, a sense of power. He doesn't want that because that's going to impact the way people look at him. He wants to just be there, be accepted in that social setting, and be dismissed, ignored. That's how you get really good data, because they don't care if you're there. They even don't notice you or don't care. And think about that as simple as if you were standing having a discussion about faculty in the hallway or maybe in the learning commons there at school. If I came along and sort of slowed down near where you're talking, I'm thinking some of you might shift your language, what you're talking about. You might not want me to hear all of what you say. But if the cleaner's there, she comes by, she hears something good, she slows down and just spends a little more time maybe cleaning the walls or cleaning something near so she can listen. I'm going to guess you don't even know who she is. Anybody know the cleaner's name? Do you notice her when she's around? If you're standing talking or if you're sitting talking in the commons? Do you even notice when they're there? Do you know if we have if they're men or women? Think about that as in terms of a place of having less social power and yet access. You get access because you have that lower social status or social power. What's interesting is there's one that got me thinking about this. Jackie used to work here several years ago. She was a cleaner, and she used to grab me to tell me stories about what she heard. And she would slow down to listen. If she heard a good one, good juicy stuff, she'd slow down. And then she'd be telling, oh, John, I got to tell you what I heard today. And we kind of giggled about it because if I was coming around, if I was nearby and your things that she heard, I'm going to bet people would stop talking about it. But because she's the cleaner, they ignored her. So she got full access to some very personal conversations. She knew everybody who's doing what, to whom, where, what's going on, what people think, what students think about faculty. She got it all. She was pretty funny. But it was because of her status that allowed her access. So you get into this place of participant observation gives us status versus non-participant, we have less access. And I'm going to switch over. I'm going to watch the second video now with you. The third video from the Milgram one, because let's look at that.
I should tell you that you've not
the structured environment and the
at this.
So consider this when you go back. Was there some activity in her part that you could observe and see that she's a little uncomfortable when they tell her she's being observed here? We see facial features change. We see her put her hand up to her chest. Is that sort of an element of, being closing herself up a bit, protecting herself? You hear her language where she actually says it. And then when they talk about her decisions, he gets quite serious, the ethics. This guy's interesting because he gives you the whole ethical discussion. He goes through and says, here's the problems with what I did, and here's my difficulties, and likewise the ethical difficulties.
Said that it wasn't going to damage him long term, so.
So if by chance you had hurt Nick, whose responsibility would that have been?
Well, in the eyes of the law, it would have been my fault, and morally.
So very interesting, this one. Then you get this guy, or the other young guy who says, I just did my job. No thought of it. And then you get this fellow who gives us
in Second World War Germany. It wasn't me, Goff. I was told to do it.
The majority of people go.
So he's got a realist point that brings in some past knowledge that sort of makes sense of it. So if you consider those positions, what you see there, observing it, and in a structured setting, we can inquire later, put some analysis to it, put some theory to it, make sense of it. So here's the report from this media person, journalist, about how he interprets what happened. Listen to him, and I want you to consider, do you see some bias or potential bias in the way he's presented? This was a 3-part miniseries in the BBC, the way he's presented this. So let's just watch this last part. So can I get some feedback on this? What do you see? How does he report it? Anybody see any sense of potential bias in this? Am I on my own? Oh, hello. Somebody's trying.
Yeah, there is some bias, I guess, because he's reporting it through his perspective rather than, like a third person perspective.
Okay, good. What do you see? Anybody see something that sort of jumps in? You say, oh, wait a minute. What about this? Anybody potential racial bias in this?
During the experiment itself, I didn't see any other people besides Caucasian people.
Good. So, and then so when he reports the final piece, he talks about normal people, right? And he's surprised that these normal people could engage in violence. Who did he talk about when or who did they show when he talks about dismay and violence?
Yes. He showed the, African Americans or not white people.
Good. So he's got two black guys there in England. Now,
Mhm.
on the face of it, you need to inquire about that. Not because he is biased. We don't know that. And if we make the assumption and leap to he's biased, we've got the same problem as what we're thinking he might have. We are no better. We need to ask the question and make some inquiry, do some research on it. So I went and I looked into it. It's the first time that I ran this and it was raised, somebody in class raised it for me and said, hang on a minute, how come he shows two black guys when he talks about violence? So they look like, I'm gonna guess they're probably in around their 30s. But then I went and I looked at the researcher, and here's where sometimes the archival or historical stuff, but certainly archival starts to help. You look at his research, he did research and reported on soccer hooliganism in England. So soccer hooliganism is at the end of soccer matches, you'd have hundreds of people out on the street and they'd get into outright fights over, and it's one team versus the other, not the soccer players, the fans. Fights in the street, fights in bars. Sometimes you'd get a whole bunch of them marching down the street like it's like a little riot going on, and it's gone on for a long time. It's was a big problem in England. So when you look at that, you say, so he did research on hooligans. And if you would go into how did he get his sample set? So ideally, he'd have to find somebody who would talk to him about it. He'd have to go do interviews. One person gives him another person, gives him another. Now, potentially, he is actually biased, and that is showing up in his videos because he attributes violence with black males. The other could be it's a snowball effect, and what he's done is look for some people that were engaged as soccer fans, engaged in the hooligan activity. So it's damaging places or fighting. He found some that were willing to talk, and these two guys happen to be two who are willing to speak up and say, yes, I did actually. I'm not proud of it, but yeah, I did, because that's just what everybody did. That might be all he got. And they might be the only two guys who are willing to speak, and they happen to be black. That recognizing the potential for bias and then dissecting it and trying to find out if it actually is bias or not is a big deal. That's a really important part of doing good research, or reviewing research to decide whether you're going to rely on it or not. So something to consider, and that video shows us that. So they are not participants, either of those people doing the research. The scientist is not a participant either. The scientist is just a part of the structure of the environment. So don't confuse that person as the scientist either. Now, I want you to think about frame analysis is another important term. Frame analysis is this. If you think about a picture frame, I think is the easiest way to make sense of it. So in the frame, please, you look at what's the picture frame. So there's the frame around the thought. Here's my thoughts for this material. It ties to research methods. This is the frame of reference for all of these words because they are about grounded theory approach, or a grounded approach to research, and they are in a research methods course. So it's quite that simple. That's the frame of reference for this set of words. When you look at social activity, you want to look at the frame of reference of the people involved. So Goffman wrote this book called Frame Analysis, and it's sort of the third rewrite of what he saw coming out of the psychiatric facilities. Let me bring you another, I've got another picture here I want you to look at. So consider this. What do you see there? House in the woods? Odd house in the woods. Does that look familiar in any way to anybody? Yes, no. What if I put it in this way? What's this house? What's this? Dr. Seuss house? picture we've all seen, or we're familiar with this sort of art that's that comes out of Dr. Seuss books. So if you look at this art as a frame of reference, oh yeah, Dr. Seuss, I remember that as a kid or whatever. Or I was reading it last year because it's first year university. So here's our Dr. Seuss house. And when you go back and look at this one now, does it start to look familiar at all? Is this somebody trying to build a real life version of this, perhaps? To some degree? Ultimately, we've changed the frame of reference. This was a house, an odd house in the woods. Now it's a Dr. Seuss house in the woods. So that sense of, once you think about it, you've given a different perspective on it. You've got a different frame of reference. So, and what we're trying to do is analyze that frame to make sense of what occurred, what's in the background that makes sense of what you see, the activity that you see. So within that context, like the pictures, what are people doing? So what Goffman got out of the looking at the psychiatric facilities, he takes the role as cleaner. Role with low status, nobody sees him as having power. They might ignore him in the room. He might have keys to come and go. He might not have keys. He has no decisions relative to the patients that are in that place. He's just there. He's present in the room. He gets complete access to their activity because they don't care he's there. They're not changing what they do. So his first book is called Asylums. It's up here. And that is a straight sociological description of what he saw. He develops this notion of a total institution. The total institution is that piece that has purview. It's an important word, purview over your life. Whatever you do exists with, occurs because of the thing that sort of overarches your life. It's bigger than you. So if you live in a jail, if you live in a psychiatric facility, they oversee your life. But likewise, education is that. We've institutionalized education systems. From the time you were in grade 1, you sat, I'm going to guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, but if you all sat at a desk, sitting in a room, looking to the front, and the teacher standing at the front, giving you information?
Yep.
That's an institution. That's what you do. Do you remember as a kid when the bell rang? There's usually 2 bells at a school, but for going in, 1 bell rings and everybody lines up, and then the second bell rings and everybody goes in.
Mm-hmm.
So think about this at 14. I went and I watched, so I've got friends that I took them to school one day or picked them up, my friends' kids. And I watched these kids in the schoolyard. So the older kids are playing basketball, the grade 8 kids. So they're what, 14, 13, 15 maybe? They're playing basketball. That first bell rings. All the kids go and line up. I get the little kids lining up. Kindergarten kids in grade 1 go on one side. All the other kids go on the other side. All those guys playing basketball, there's, I don't know, a bunch of them. They all put their ball away and they all went and lined up too. And I'm thinking, I remember watching, thinking, so they're all standing in line waiting for 5 minutes. The next bell rings and they all go in. And I'm thinking, they probably lost 10 minutes of fun because of that first bell. It's not interesting. So if I was there, I would have kept playing basketball. I would say, well, it's okay. That's the bell rang. Everybody has to line up, but then they all got to get in. So we can play ball till they start moving, because once they're moving, then we can stop and grab our bag and go and get at the very end of the line and get into school on time. So they, maybe not 10, they probably got 7 or 8 minutes though of extra basketball time they could play. They're enjoying their game. I found it interesting though, at that old, so they've been at school now for 8 years, and what they've done is learn to line up at the bell. They don't think about it. Nobody thinks we're having fun, keep going. They'll just go line up because they don't think about it. That's what makes it institutional. They don't think about it, they just do it. Non-thinking place. So they're not empowered because they've got no decision to make. They just join in and do it. If they actually stopped and said, should we line up or shouldn't we, that starts to shift the power dynamic a bit. They might still choose to go along, but if they don't even think about it, they just first bell, pack up and line up, then they are institutionalized. So the individuals within the institution all essentially go along. They agree to that organization. Now the organization is not, don't think about that like a company. It's not a corporation, it's an organization. It's a group of people. It could be 2 or 3 people establish an organization. We work together in conjunction somehow. That makes us an organization. So Asylums is the first one where he gets us to look at total institution. The next book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. That one I posted for you to look at on Aries. If you haven't read it, read it. I've only given you the introduction to it. If there is one book in sociology to read, I would read Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It is the book that makes the most sense to me of trying to understand human behavior, what people do in social settings. So in it, he's taken the work from Asylums and he's shifted it over and he's given it analogy to the stage. He talks about the front stage and the backstage. These are really key terms to understand. The front stage is like in a theater. It is the show that you get to watch. If you've been to live theater, you've seen it, people on the stage. Or maybe in grade 5 or 6 or something, there was a play at the school you watched or you were in. It's the people on the stage. That's the front stage. It's meant for everybody to see. Then there's the backstage activity that nobody's supposed to see. That's the things that make the front stage work. That's the people behind the counter that do behind the curtains. They do makeup, they do costumes, they make sure the microphones are in the right place. They do all those little things that make the show look right. We don't see that because it's behind the curtain. Now, the front stage is meant highly visible, everybody's supposed to see it. Goffman used the term base work. This is the stuff we do to impression management. It is the things we do to give a good impression to others. We give them the impression we want them to give. The clothes we wear. The image I want you to have of me. I do things to make that work. I want you to think have the most authority in the room, so I might do something like, say, class starts at 8, you're not allowed to come in late. At 8 o'clock, the door's locked. Nobody comes in my room. That would be an activity I engage in to reinforce the front stage performance that I'm in charge. So the organizational presentation now has other people involved in it. There might be a couple of us do it. I might want you to think I'm a nice guy, so here's the things I do that are consistent with being a nice guy. Now, I might just be trying to manipulate that, or I might actually be a nice guy, but it's the things that I do that help you to form an opinion of me. There's a thing that people on the stage do that help us to say, oh, that was a good performance. We clap at the end of a performance because they did a good job. So it's about, and that's what people on the stage do. They get paid to do it, and if they do it well, they get an standing ovation. And if they do it really well, they get a second ovation. They come out and they bow a second time. Imagine you're on the stage, or if you're watching a performance, people are on the stage, they come out, they bow, they go off the curtain. Everybody in the audience gets up and starts to leave. And then the actors all come out to give another bow, except everybody's leaving the room. How good was your performance? So that notion of performance, of face work, giving off an impression of what I want you to see me as, is a huge social issue. People that are lower status don't tend to buy into an organization as well. So your parents set up what your family should look like. Here's how we show up, we're close, but as you're older in your teens, maybe you're not going to family functions the same anymore. At work, what you saw in your coffee shop, you've got people that give off an image of what they're supposed to be at Tim Hortons. Here's what it means to provide customer service. They don't want you to hear and see their conversations about each other, about personal stuff. They just want you to deal with what they're providing to you. Ideally, what you saw in this last lab, when you did participant observation, when you are in this place of participation, when you are very much engaged in participant stuff, versus non-participant, oh my Lord, versus non-participant, what you've done is, see if that worked. In this place, when you're over here in your activities, you got lots of exposure. You know who the players are, and you get to see and interpret their activities because you have more data to work with. You've got the words, which we saw a little bit in Milgram, when the people explain what they were thinking. That helps for us to understand it, but we're still looking from outside. In the place you are, because you know the players as a participant, you're fully engaged as a member of the social group. So you get to see it, and you also have more data to interpret with. You understand facial features, you understand body language better, you understand what you might see in a group. We might have a group of people that maybe we get together all the time. We've got a Friday night thing that we do. But if you watch, and this is why I had you do it, that group that you're watching now, you might find that there's two people who don't, neither of them will agree to go to do something until they know the other one agrees with them. These two people are more connected to each other than the rest of the group. So they'll join in with the group, but they need an affirmation from the other before either would say, oh yeah, okay, we'll go. I don't know if any of you have seen that or think about that with your friends. Did any of you get, while you were doing your observations, did any of you get noticed in whether you were talking or not? Any of you sort of get caught watching? No? Some yes, some no. So what I found, what's interesting in this, and how I sort of stumbled onto this lab, so my mother's house is a small house. It's, and we gather around. So there's 4 siblings, all our kids. There's probably about 20 people sat around a table. Now that table is about the same size as if you took 4 tables from at school up on the 4th floor, those tables that you sit at that we can put, what do you put, 4 people at it? Her table, when we put extensions and stuff on it, is probably about that big. And then you've got chairs outside in front of it, right? So we put some chairs out. And if any of you have been in a big family, you've got maybe a couple of chairs and then some planks of wood across for people so you could get more people piled in. So that's how we would sit around the table. Now, we'd get talking, and there's 4 siblings. I have a sister, an older sister, then a brother, then a 3-year gap, then me and another brother. So there's 4 of us. What would happen when we got into these conversations, though, is we'd get sort of really interested conversations, just keep going along. And one day on the way home, my wife said to me, you guys are really loud. Like, you realize you guys are yelling when you're having those conversations? No, we're not. She said, oh, yeah, you are. No, we're not. Yes, you are. No, we're not. So anyways, that's back and forth for a while. The next time I go to my mom's, though, what's interesting is I sat at the table and I watched. I went quiet and I watched what went on, and I realized she's absolutely right. We all raise our voice to press our point. I am the quietest of the 4 of us. So think about what that's like in a little small area. It is the room is about the size of your the bathroom at Guelph Humber. So you've got my other 3 siblings all talk more than me, and they all talk louder than me. So there's a lot of volume. We think we are a close family. People would see us as a close family. The neighbor who shares the wall of my mother's house on the other side would not tell you for 1 second we're a close family. He'd say, I hear them yelling, and I hear a lot of thumping and banging, because we were teenagers. We all wrestled. 3 boys, we wrestled. We wrecked my mother's couch 3 times. We had to flip it upside down and put it back together and fix it because we broke it wrestling and falling on the couch. So he would hear this backstage material that others wouldn't. He didn't know we were wrestling. He just hears the thumping and banging and yelling. His view would be fighting. But to the outside world, we're seen as a close family. That he got a little different exposure. His frame of reference is only hearing auditory what was going on. So from his frame of reference, he would see us as not a close family. And he would say, no, they're not, because of what he heard. Others that see us would say we are. Those of us inside the group would say we are. So the frame of reference for how we decide what to do and then how we report on it becomes important. What you get, so that notion of lower status and upper status becomes a significant piece in starting to dissect what's going on in a social group. Just a reminder, these words that are in the boxes on the slides, make sure you know those. Those are the key points for when you start thinking about studying for the final. These are some key points that are sort of the foundation of everything we do. So you get this enacted environment. The enacted environment is a different place. It's where I adopt the role, and it's like the role is real. I'm not thinking about what I'm doing and trying to look good. I've actually taken it in. Police do this. They're the authority they carry sometimes. Teachers with authority are a big part of this. This is really interesting. So I teach this same course in a justice program and as well in an early childhood program. Both of those programs they're for people that are working in the field and decide they want to come back for school. Interesting, you would expect the police to have authorities that would come with them. But for the most part, what I see with them is they come into the room and they come in as learners, and they're engage in the room or don't engage in the room, but much like you do. They are just regular students. They're just an older group for the most part. The early childhood people, though, are all teachers, right? They're educators. They teach small children. They do a lot of telling what to do. When I teach that group, what's really interesting is huge authority comes out of them. They can't give up that role. It's an enacted role. They've completely adopted, not all, but many, completely adopted this place of being a person in authority who gets to tell. So they will sit in the room and tell me how to run my course. Not, oh, what about this? Well, it's not. And in the policing side, which is police, corrections, probation, people with some social power, we would say empowered positions, who make decisions about others, they do a lot of buy-in in their jobs. So telling, the absolute authority sort of comes later, like they step to it. Teachers, they're not so much buy-in. There's a lot more straight authority telling people what to do. So in the classroom, as learners, they're still doing the same thing, just telling me what to do. They are trapped in this place of an enacted environment. They've adopted it like it's real, like they actually have that authority. And it takes them a little while to figure out that they don't get to decide how the course is going to be run because they signed up for a course that I'm running. So you get this interesting place. The enacted places. So if you watch faculty, I think I've said this before, if you watch faculty, how they behave, you start to see that we are supposed to come and teach this material, and we're supposed to be experts, and we're supposed to know it all, and we impart that information to you, and you watch, and then you see some who will never admit a mistake. They won't admit they don't know something. They won't, or some who won't go away from the podium. They stand really close to the podium because that's where the words are that they got to make sure they deliver to have it right. So they're not going to take the chance of screwing that up. So they stay near the podium where they can keep their words nice and close. So consider that as an enacted place. Then you get, so you've got audience. What Kaufman brings to us, so the total institution, front stage, backstage material, you get this notion of audience. I present myself in a particular way because of the way the audience responds. If I don't have an audience, I don't. The face work you do, I'm going to guess most of you behave differently with friends, with family, at school, at work, out in public perhaps. Some don't. Some of us don't change much. And if you don't change much, those are the people around you that you just feel comfortable with, people that you don't know very well, what you have this comfortable sense with. That's probably because they don't change much. There's not a lot of face work. So where you've got a lot of face work, and from Goffman's point of view, we all do it to some degree. If they're doing it in a psych facility, it's no different than what we do in regular people people in regular social spaces, no different. So we start to be caught up in, how will I be looked upon? How do I present myself to avoid being criticized? How do I not get embarrassed? Think about when you've been at the front of the room presenting. Any of you comfortable being at the front of the room presenting? Or most of you uncomfortable at the front of the room? I'm going to bet most of us are uncomfortable public speaking in front of the room, and what we're worried about is making a mistake, being embarrassed, face work. So if we get this, so good, some like public speaking, good for you. I do, clearly. So what's interesting is when you see actors and teachers saying how they're shy, and I think, I can't imagine standing at the front of the room and doing this and being shy. I understand being pushed to it, because there's lots where I've pushed you to present in other courses that you're not comfortable, and it's clear you're not. You tell me you're not, and I can see you're not. So it's, well, give it a try, do the best you can. But there's others that, why would you take a job that is all about public speaking if you're not comfortable, or if you're shy? Seems sort of interesting. What you get though, is you start to think about how that delivery to an external audience goes. There's a group of people that, who sets the tone of what it should be, what it should look like? Who speaks that look, when they talk, the things they say interfere with the presentation? It starts to challenge what we think it means. Who speaks for, so right now, this whole strike thing, who speaks for management? What if some management people spoke out and said they supported the strike? That would undo the management position that teachers need to be pushed back to work. If the union is saying how important all this is, and they go on with their arguments, or rhetoric, if you want, rhetorical points, if you saw it as rhetoric in your faculty and you speak out against it, that would undermine the presentation, the organizational presentation that, well, no, faculty all don't agree with this. And then when you get a whole bunch of faculty who say, no, we're okay with this, then it undoes that performance. So you start to look at these day-to-day banal experiences. That's the term that Goffman uses. It's the little subtle things that occur where you help to make sense of it. The little things you saw when you were engaged with your group, and watching what they did. Did anybody, so trying to take notes, anybody try and take notes while you're watching your little social group, doing your participant observation? Would that be difficult? Consider that. Would they, some people were saying with technology, you can text or make it look like you're texting when you're taking your notes. Okay, that works. Some of the difficulty of participant observations is you can't make your notes until later. So that makes it harder. Quickly to bounce through Goffman here, some of what Goffman did is you get Asylums, is his first book. Nice, clean, descriptive analysis of what goes on in a psych facility. Then you get, and he comes up with the notion of total institution. Then he reworks it into the presentation of self in everyday life. And that is where he brings in this stage analogy, front stage, backstage, to make sense of it. It's the idea that there is impression management, there's performance issues going on within the part of each person in a social engagement. And then he writes this book, Stigma, and it's around the same time as Frame Analysis. So Frame Analysis is it's a thicker book, and the concept of similar concepts of that we get out of presentation of self in everyday life, but he puts it into much more. It's just straight sociological theory. It's a little harder to read, but still worth a read. But I'm not going to push you to read it. Stigma comes out around the same time, though, because what he realizes in this performance thing is everybody's doing it. People that are, so think about labeling theory. That notion that we say with children, if you tell a little kid they're bad, you keep calling them bad, they'll grow up and be bad. If you tell a teenager they're a criminal, if you put that label on their head, they'll grow up and continue to engage in criminal activity. I'm not sure I agree with that. I was a bad kid growing up all the way through. I spent half my grade 1 year in the corner or down in the office. So at the end of the day, my life's working out for the most part. Am I bad? Was I bad? I was. So I didn't buy into the label. I wasn't stigmatized by it. It was just terminology they used for me. Whatever. Stigma is when I buy into the label. I accept the symbols that go with that label. I'm affected by what others say to the degree that I internalize it. If you come into the room in a wheelchair, I'm going to bet that if somebody comes into one of our classrooms in a wheelchair, you look up. If somebody comes in blind with a dog, you look up. There is an element of being observed. If you're the person coming in the room in a wheelchair or with a cane, maybe not with a seeing eye dog, but maybe it's a hearing dog. If you've got somebody coming in like that, if you're that person coming in, you know that everybody's going to look at you. It's the same as being at the front of the class doing your presentation. So how do you manage that? So the book Stigma is managing the spoiled identity. It is that managing that situation when people look at you and see you as other, see you as different. But if you don't buy into it, then it turns different. So if I get you to look at this, my brother's a big guy. He's bigger than this. His hair is whiter. He's in a wheelchair. When he rolls in, if he's in the city and he goes into a mall, often there'll be some small child who'll say, Mommy, why is Santa in a wheelchair? And he's also got little half glasses like mine, but he's got those little half ones here. And the kid will ask, and I'm going to guess you all know what the parent says, right? Shh, no, don't say that. So what you get in this place, though, is, so he's a big guy, big beard, little glasses. If he was offended by it, that would be buying into the stigma piece. By not buying into the stigma piece, his response is, and this is the frame analysis, he realizes, so raised Catholic, so gets Christmas, gets the Santa thing. So he understands that kid's beautiful, naive perspective of that guy looks like Santa and he's in a wheelchair. It's a straightforward question. He doesn't say, oh, that little kid is calling me disabled, and the term disabled means I'm less able, I can't do. He doesn't take all that because it's not stigmatizing to him. It's just language. It's the frame analysis that allows him to take it as language because he can get outside of his own frame and look at the frame of reference for that kid. If he internalized it and he had a negative feeling attached to it, then we could say stigma. So this book, Frame Analysis, that Goffman comes up with, gives us this whole conceptual idea of thinking about how does someone see their world? How do those people in the psychiatric facility see their world? They see the world in terms of the walls, the doors that they can't go outside unless somebody unlocks them, the inability to go outside without permission. And he starts to see that they adapt to that reality. And in their adapting, he starts to say, oh, so some of them are conscious of what's going on and they're very aware of their presentation. Others are not. And if we start to understand the individual activity within that group dynamic, it starts to make a lot of sense. So I think I'm going to stop there. We've been an hour. Anybody need a break? I think we're going to stop there and let's take a break. 10 minutes? Is 10 minutes enough? Anybody need more? Anybody need 15?
Whatever works.
Yeah, I'm good with 10 unless I hear 15. Okay, 10 it is. I'll see you at about 3:45 then. We'll keep going. We're gonna pop back into the video to watch the Zimbardo video when we come back. Back. We lost a couple. Let's have a look at the video here. We're going to look at Zimbardo. I'm going to clip through some of it, but it's worth watching the whole thing, really. But I'll give you enough to give you a sense of looking at what do we see, that variation between structured, unstructured, participant versus non-participant. It gives us a little bit of a different exposure. So let's have a look. Share computer sound. All right, here we go.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
So Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room, if anything else, because they were very small.
150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
Milgram.
So that's the original Milgram experiment, 1961. Milgram is seen as bad science. Milgram sets the tone for the world looking at it and saying, what are you doing? We shouldn't do this. We've lied to people in order to understand why people do things. And they saw it as researchers shouldn't really do it. So Milgram's the bad guy. Zimbardo comes along 10 years later and does the prison experiment. So ethics has started to be raised. This is the 70s. So we sort of think of the 70s as the hippie movement. It's not actually. That already occurred. The 60s was the break from just straight authority of parents. The 60s is, by the time the 70s hits, students are feeling much like you do today, probably. You don't have to listen to their authority the same. You're entitled to decide for yourself. Prior to this, it was a lot more parental dominance and pressure. Here by the time they get here, they're not in the middle of that struggle. They've already lived through it, and these people are living in the back end of the comfort of that struggle.
It was from the student body that Zimbardo selected his participants. After passing tests to screen out anyone with a psychological abnormality, they were paid $15 a day. Each was randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner.
So, think about this. I want to run this little experiment at school. We want to play the jail guard prisoner thing, and we don't want to see just what happens. So we're just going to give you the role. You go in, you do whatever it is. You're going to be. We don't know when you're picked whether you will be a guard or a prisoner. That'll get figured out later. It's random. You could be on either team. I'm going to pay you $1,000 a week. It's a 2-week. We're going to do this for 2 weeks just to see what happens. Anybody in for $1,000 a week? I would. So I don't know about some of you might not. Think about why you would or why you wouldn't. So this bunch have signed up thinking, well, it'd be interesting. So let's see what they have to say.
It was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an...
Found this thing which was just going to fit. It was just 2 weeks.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a job to keep these...
Hear that? Given a job to keep these people...
Can create the notion that their life is totally controlled by us, and that there'll be constant surveillance. We have total power in the situation, and they have none.
So Zimbardo sets this up, and this is where you get into the participant piece. He doesn't just remain the observer, like in the Milgram experiment, outside watching what people do. He engages, he adopts a role as prison superintendent as well. So he's taken on a role, but it's a role that's empowered, not like Milgram or Goffman, who takes on a role, but takes on the role of cleaner, a low social status role. Goffman's taken on a role where, as the observer running the project, he wants to see it all, but he adopts the role of jail superintendent, so everybody would see him in a position of power again. He hasn't given anything up. So that causes some grief. He's got too engaged as a participant. Look what the guards...
Prisoners were brought to the basement prison, blindfolded, to confuse them about their whereabouts.
I still didn't feel at all like I was in the prison. I was just looking at it as
about prisons being a court, a hallway, which was the
deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's a start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
So they're all aware that they're being observed, they're being filmed. They know that. So there is this element of being watched. Think about the Hawthorne effect, right? The impact of being watched, what that means to you. So how much of their behavior is unconscious and acted, and how much of it is decided on and acted out intentionally, given that they know they're being observed?
When I first got here, even though I had to strip and they would call me names, I still didn't feel at all like I was in the prison. I was just looking at it as a job.
I recall sort of walking up and down the very short hallway, which was the prison hall, and looking in on the prisoners, and they're basically lounging around on their beds. I felt it was...
This guy's important, David Eshelman. He is the dominant key guard in this, or one of the key guards in this experiment. Listen carefully to what he has to say. So he is a research subject. He's one of the people that are being watched. But when you listen to what he says and watch what he does, talks about, he has taken on a role much like a participant, observer, researcher, although he's not supposed to be that. That sort of, he pretty much describes it for us, what that would be like.
Was like the day in summer camp.
The first day I said, this might be a very long, very boring experiment because it's conceivable nothing will happen.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
So hear what he said. It's confrontational and arrogant. What brought him to learn that about himself is interesting, perhaps. But in that is, he decided he should stir things up a bit. So he's decided to impact the environment. Two things: change some of the variables, change an independent variable and see if it affects a dependent variable. That's what he's doing. This is a structured research project. It's structured in the sense of the location it's in, what those social rules are, And then beyond that, and then it runs for 2 weeks. Beyond that, then it's to look and see what occurs. So those are the structures. Those are the independent variables that are left intact. They're the stable pieces in it. The constants, it would be the language. The independent variable is what do the guards do? And then the dependent variable is, and how do the prisoners respond? Now it starts to, and this is where when you get out of the structured observation project, in this unstructured observation, you've got this ability to see social activity in a broad way. You get big, so, and Zimbardo brings some important data to us. But this guy has decided to stir the pot. So he knows that he is intentionally affecting the outcome for the activities and that it will impact the outcomes.
Being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you know, you little punk, you big shit, and so, and the guards got furious.
Everybody out! Well, gentlemen, here it is time for count.
I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment. Zimbardo responded not as a psychologist, but as a prison superintendent.
I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally.
So he's now confused his role. Which is it? Both come with authority, different kinds of authority.
You know, this is fucking crazy.
The boundary is that he...
I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside. Now!
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming and, you know, whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, you know, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
So there's the enacted environment. So he took on a social role. He's playing the part of the prisoner, rebelling. He's playing that part. It's all intentionally done. It is a role. It is a theatrical performance. In that sense, just like regular theater, it's done intentionally. The enacted piece, though, is where that theatrical performance becomes more unconscious and the person owns it. It's attached to them. And so his behaviors and how he feels, all is about more the enacted place than just a performance.
The boundary between reality and make-believe was to become blurred even for Zimbardo. A rumor circulated that released prisoner 861 was the next prisoner to rebel against the harassment of the guards.
So they got this notion they're going to break out. Zimbardo goes and guards the place to make sure it doesn't happen, and they don't go anywhere. He's lost sight. So that's the going native piece the book talked about. You're so engaged in your research project that you forget who you really are, and you're there to observe, and you actually engage in the activity with the people. You start to believe in them or believe in their beliefs. You get tied to them in a much bigger way than, so the enacted role would do that in this sort of scenario.
Barricaded himself in his cell and refused.
819 and saying, okay, you know, it's all over. Thank you for your participation. You know, I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early. He hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing.
So the guy does eventually leave. He goes back, but then he to the cells.
I was blindfolded and then stripped.
We got a new guy comes in. So this is day 4. It's already gone on. Everybody else there is adjusted to the environment. They're either playing or have adopted the role. This guy is new. He doesn't recognize the power stuff, and that's what you're looking for in research. If you're doing the research, that's what you're looking for. If you read research, that's what you're looking to see. How do they show you where the power existed?
And supposedly deloused.
He came into a madhouse, full blown, all of us had graduated.
As intimidating, as cold, as cruel as possible.
I love you too, American. Get up close. Get up. Down on that floor. And fuck the floor. What would you do then?
One of the best guards was also on that shift. And instead of confronting this bad guard, the sadistic guard, essentially because he didn't want to see what was happening, he became the gopher. He would.
Significant observation. We'll come back.
The madness of the experiment started to affect.
Everything that we had worked for the first
meals, I saw that this was not a matter of indifference to the guards. I was making headway. They were
Start
upset.
the hunger strike. This is the new guy. Challenging the power.
I thought, how dare this newcomer come in and try to change everything that we had worked for the first 3 days to set up, and by God, he's going to suffer for that.
Get in that closet then.
Frustrated by his continued defiance, John Wayne threw prisoner 416 into the hole.
So now he's shifted again. His role is, he knows he's being observed, and his role is one of power, but it seems the way he's described it there that perhaps he's moved to an enacted place. He's actually pissed off this guy has challenged him. So it becomes unconscious.
And sleep on the bare mattress.
Who are the victims of abuse.
We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3, guess one. Keep your blankets. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
The study showed that power corrupts, and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of abuse to stand up and defend themselves. Why doesn't anybody who is being abused by a spouse or something like that just say, stop it? And we realize now that that's not as easy as it sounds.
So he comes out, he draws his conclusion, power corrupts. Maybe. That's a big leap from these observations. It corrupted him, or watch, because there's some more analysis of his activity.
Bags over their head, chains on their feet, and we're marching by. And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, we had a big shame in their role. Guards felt guilt.
Like his stimulated, heated debate.
You're letting it happen.
So there's a psychologist who comes in at one point early and says, what are you doing? And challenges Zimbardo and says, what's your independent variables? What's your dependent variables? And Zimbardo tosses him out, says, because he just dismisses what the guy's got to say. We're doing an interesting project. This other fellow comes in and they present her in this argument. So she gets upset.
Chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just, I just turned away and I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
Basically.
So she gets him to shut it down. Now in it, they present her as, this other fellow psychologist who came and got him to think what he's doing. It's his girlfriend. Right? Excuse me, hang on. Whoa, excuse me. So frame analysis. If you think about the frame on that, if she's just another psychologist, he listens to what she has to say maybe. The fact that she's his girlfriend might well have had a little more impact on his willingness to listen to what she said. That's the frame of reference we need to get. If you want to understand what's going on in a social dynamic, you need to get the frame of reference of the players.
Prisoners felt shame in their role. Guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
In the wake of experiments he had tormented,
I was a little worried. I said, oh my God, he's really...
So what they get out of this, though, that piece I just skipped, is they realized what's gone on in jails and how that works. And Abu Ghraib more recently, where we realized how bad it got. It was just like this, just was the same sort of thing going on, but way worse. And we can make sense of that because of this research. So the research is enlightening. At what expense is the ethical issue. But let's watch what this guy has to say now, because he's been involved. He's had an impact on the environment. He knows what he's been doing. He's conscious of it.
They're going to come down on me hard now, now that we're on equal footing.
It harms me. How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. Because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do.
When I look back on it now, I behaved appallingly. It was just horrid to look at. I think I tried to explain to him at the time that, what you experienced and what you hated so much was a role that I was playing, but that's not me at all.
He was trying to dissociate himself from what he had done. That did make me angry. Everyone was acting out a part and playing a role. Prisoners, guards, staff, everyone was acting out a part. It's when you start contributing to the script.
So you hear that, contributing to the script, impacting the environment. So for Goffman impacted the environment just by being different when Naren and clearly every time he spoke sounded different, as opposed to this, the intentional changing of positive activity that makes a difference. Like Milgram is the scientist saying, carry on.
That's you, and thus it's something you should take responsibility for.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could.
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
Why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start lashing back.
If I have any regret right now, it's that I made that decision, because it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had I not decided to force things.
And there's what a participant observation.
It could be that I only accelerated them, that the same things would have happened, but we'll never know.
If the extreme nature of Dave Eshelman's behavior tested the prisoners, it also presented the other guards with a choice, to intervene or not.
It surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. They just accepted what I said, and no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
There were a few guards who hated to see the prisoners suffer. They never did anything which would be demeaning of the prisoners. The interesting thing is, none of the good guards ever intervened in the behavior of the guards who gradually became more and more sadistic over time. We like to think there is this core of human nature that good people can't do bad things and that good people will dominate over bad situations. In fact, one way to look at the Stanford Prison Study is that we put good people in an evil place and we saw who won. Well, the sad message is, in this case, the evil place won over the good people.
So it's an interesting...
It shows some very interesting and maybe some unpleasant things about human behavior. It seems like, every century, every decade that we go through, we're suffering the same kind of atrocities. And you need to understand why these things happen. You need to understand why people behave like this.
So it's pretty insightful analysis after the fact. When they bring the theory to it, it makes sense. It says it wasn't a good thing that we did, but what we got out of it was valuable. We understand now war. We understand the frame of reference. We understand how people can engage and join in a war that maybe they don't believe in. How we can understand now the German population, the whole German war machine. It was a political Nazi party, which is an extremist party in Germany, that starts this whole genocide issue. The regular German army are regular people. They're farmers who want to just farm. They just want their life back. But they get conscripted. Why do they sign up? Why do they show up? Why do they shoot? Because somebody tells them to. So it's helpful to understand how that authority plays out. If all of the people in war didn't shoot, just said, we're not doing this, there'd be no war. But they do as they're told. Why? And that it helps us to understand that. But at what expense? So if we start to look through what you start to see from the notion of an emerging theme, we do the observations. In Zimbardo, we do the naturalistic observation. Here's what's going on. We just see it. make sense of it, and say, oh, here's some theory that applies. This makes sense of what we start to see. Where are the power struggles? Who's engaged? What are the subgroups within a performing team? In your group, you might have seen that, like I said, those couple of people that have a little different, they check with each other before they agree to do stuff. Lower status and higher status is a big deal. Deference patterns are what you're looking for. Who defers to, who allows the other to have final say? So back to my family. We've got a sister and brother. They're about a year and a bit apart. And then 3 years later, there's another two brothers, myself and my younger brother. We're about a year apart. But there's a 3-year gap between the two sets. What I realized in that observation of my family, which is like your own, my younger brother and I will let my sister, and this is because I went quiet and started to watch, so somebody got me to do that. But what I realized is my younger brother and I will allow my sister to have final say. If she makes a comment or she makes a close, we'll accept that she can have final say. Yeah, good enough. Her comment is valid. My older brother will never give in. So there's the observation. He will fight tooth and nail till the end because he's not giving in to her. Now, sibling rivalry sort of makes sense of that. But what makes sense of the two much younger, so I'm 4 years younger than her, my other brother's 5 years younger, what makes us go along with her authority? What makes us defer to her as having final say? What makes sense of it? Now here's one theory, and this is what you get out of a grounded approach. You start to think about a theory and say, so deference patterns, you look at socialization, you look at family dynamics and say, oh, this might make sense of it. Attribution theory might work. I look and I say, my Nana was a matriarchal home. So her husband died when her kids were young teenagers. She raised them on her own, struggled, and she was in charge, very much in charge. As I remember as a small child growing up and going to my Nana's house, there are well over 20 cousins who would show up. And when we all showed up, everybody was scared of Nana. We all loved, like, very loving grandparent. But if she got mad or she yelled at you or she gave you the look, everybody was scared to death of her. Little tiny woman, small, short, tiny little thing, scared to death of her, all of us. That look was the world. I don't know if any of you had that from a grandparent or a parent. You just know what it means. Something bad's coming your way if you don't stop. So it's essentially a statement, a look that says line up. So that's my Nana's house. So we're exposed to that. Then there's my own house. When I was young and my father was around, it was a case of my mom was in charge. So whenever anything came up, it would always he deferred to her. What's your mom say? My mom had final say and everything. That was just agreed to amongst them. As a teenager, he wasn't around. So now he's a similar place, 4 teenagers, a matriarchal home. My mother is in charge. It's been ingrained in us. So now she's the only one there, and it stays with us that she's in charge. And again, a matriarchal home. And then you look at my sister, the oldest, and that 4 or 5 years difference is a considerable break when you look at Adler and birth order stuff. And when you look at that, I say, oh, matriarchy fits. Matriarchy makes sense of why do the 2 young ones defer to the oldest sister? Because it's consistent with what they're used to. And birth order, she's the first, she's a woman, like the mother, like the grandmother, and she should have final say because that's just normal. That would be, now I don't know that's the right answer, that's kind of what I think, but that is applying a theory to the observation. If I describe the observation well, others could then report that theory. They could come up with a different theory that makes sense of it, different than my own. So that's how that grounded approach works. So Goffman, for him, he went in, he saw the inmates up close. Up close. He saw staff members, and this is the inconsistency with the organizational presentation. Sometimes the staff members aligned with the inmates. They would help them. Maybe they get a little more food. Maybe they get a little longer time to eat. Maybe they're allowed a utensil to eat with. There's something that the bosses don't know, and think about this yourself. Things you've done or you know people or either in your family or at work that your parents aren't aware of, or your boss isn't aware, because we kind of bend the rules to make it work. But making it work is for those others, treating someone better. Maybe in a customer service place, giving someone an extra dessert. There's a kid at the table, you give them a free dessert, or you get an extra. There's something that people do. They just give you something extra because they're just being nice. That is got this notion of breaking the lower status person, breaking from the organizational presentation. So the front region is the very obvious stuff. That's what we all see and know, people are familiar with. The back region is all of the work that goes on behind the curtain to make that presentation work. The back region is what you're trying to see. You're trying to understand, why do they do that? It's by getting exposed to the back region helps you to understand why. In Milgram, what we saw of the redo of the Milgram experiment, we can see the activity. When they explain it, they tell us now some of their back region. The words help us to see, to hear what they're thinking. The camera in front of them when they're making decisions helps us to see body language. It might be data we can interpret as well. So everything is about that front stage, that impression management. It's getting people to see things in a certain way. Goffman is later seen as a symbolic interactionist. He looks for symbols, he sees symbols. What he saw in the psych facility, something like a set of keys. He realizes everybody in the room goes quiet as the nurses or doctors or orderlies are coming in. And what he realizes after watching for a while is, it's actually what's causing them to go quiet is the jingling keys outside the door. It's not the door opening and people coming through. It's the key. The sound of keys at the door or outside the door, if you think about those people who got a lot of keys and the keys jingle, that sound is a symbol of power. It's the symbol that people are coming through that door who are going to have some say whether you get to go outside next time. The inmates want to go outside. Sunday is the day they get to go outside. Sunday is 5 days away. They need to behave for 5 days. But they may not understand 5 days. They may not actually be counting. They just know, think about when you were a child, you might have had an experience like this. You just know the next time that everybody goes outside, you want to go too. The next time we go to grandma's, I want to go too. The next time we want to go to visit someone where it's a fun place to go, I want to go too. It's as simple as that. It may not be a countdown. And what he sees sometimes is people in the group helping each other to support and say, oh, it is guiding behavior. So you look good in order to be allowed to go out. You behave the right way so the guards won't prevent you from going outside next time. So the messaging becomes part of it. We'll come back to this. It becomes a communication back and forth between two parties. So observations, when you think about them, we all do it. In sociology, we do it with a purpose. We're careful. We think about what we're looking at, why we're looking at, how we note it. The trouble with participant observations is when you write it down. If you write it down later, there's stuff that you include, stuff you leave out. What do you include? What do you leave out? Why is it included? Why is it left out? Those issues are editing issues. If you're able to make your notes while you're doing your participant observation, good on you. But if you can't do them till later, you're probably going to edit them. Even doing them on this time, you might edit. Coding is another piece of observation. And it is a big deal, how we code or categorize what we see. So two ways of coding. There's the sign system, category system. The sign system is looking at saying, here's the things we look for. So in the Milgram experiment, the sign system would be every time that button is pressed, how many times when 225 volts is pressed and the voice on the other side says, ow, my heart is starting to bother me now. What's their response? So you count how many times does the person turn around and say, do I keep going? Can I stop? Do they look for a reassurance? It could be something as simple as going back to us at the beginning, how you pick your seat in the room. Maybe I want to look and see when people come in the room, how many times of the 70 people coming into the classroom, how many of them look for a familiarity with somebody before they go sit down? And how many times do they then go sit with that person that they've just connected with? Maybe eye contact, maybe a head nod between the two, maybe a wave. What are the things that help you to decide where to sit? Well, I would actually just count how many times I saw it. In a category system, you break it up by time intervals. So I might look and say, so before class happens, how often do I see this? Oh, once class starts though, if people are coming in 10 minutes after class has started, so between 10 and 20 minutes or between 10 minutes and 30 minutes into the class, I see different activity. So I might say that before class starts, people look for their friend. But if people come in after the class has actually begun, they tend to just go for the first empty seat rather than look for their friends and walk across the room and interrupt the class. So you might start to see different activities because you set it on a timeline rather than just a count. This is more quantitative. This is more qualitative. They could each be used, but they're used in different ways. The reliability of using a grounded approach is coding becomes a big part of making it reliable, helping it to be reliable. How did you code? When did you code? Did you code before? Did you code after? Did you do that flowing, flexible coding that goes with intervals with a category type of coding? Or was it very structured and you did a number count? In Milgram, certainly you could do the structured numbered count. Milgram, preset coding. When they press this button, this voice is played. What do they do? Do they do this or this? Do they do anything? In the unstructured, flexible one, that works more often, works better. It's what you're seeing there typically is the category style of activity. You could do counting, but you start to see a sense of saying there's a flow to this. Here's what is going on with this group of people. And it gives you this overview piece. Last piece on notes though. We typically make notes on the observations, what you did during your exercise. You make notes on your method, which is where you were, what you were engaged in when you did it. What part did you play? What impact did you have on the environment? What potential impact did you have on the activities of others? That's the method piece. The theory piece is, at what point did a theory start to make sense to you? How does that theory start to apply? Did that change the way you were thinking about what you were seeing and ultimately maybe change what you see because theory starts to roll in? The last one though that most people forget to do, or they don't bother, is their own personal experiences at the time. If you're doing observations, you need to be aware of what's going on. If you're exhausted because you've done 12 or 14-hour days for a week and you're making your notes at night at the end of the day, you might be exhausted after a week of that. You need to make notes on that. In that exhaustion, you might miss stuff. So it comments on your editing, it comments on how valid is your research. Is there some weaknesses? If you identify your own weaknesses, that helps to say, no, it's still okay because these are variables. But it's commenting on your own personal, yourself, in your own notes so that you can make sense of what you're seeing to some degree. So, and that is it.